The story revolves around an incident where a flight attendant, displaying racial discrimination, slapped a young black boy on an airplane and forced him off the flight. Shortly after, the airline's entire board of directors was dismissed, and the flight attendant faced consequences for her wrongful actions. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you first saw the video. Now, let's jump into the story. Snow blanketed the roads leading to Liberty Sky International Airport. Amid the bustling atmosphere, a young boy stood silently next to a signpost. Michael Carter, 12 years old, wore a finely tailored light gray coat that provided warmth while maintaining a modest appearance. His face carried a quiet composure, and his deep black eyes sparkled with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. He gripped the strap of his crossbody backpack tightly, a habit he always had when feeling uneasy. Inside the bag was a carefully wrapped book, a Christmas gift for his father, Jonathan Carter, whom he was about to reunite with after nearly a year apart. The airport buzzed with energy, but Michael seemed like a small, solitary figure lost in a sea of people. He tucked himself into a corner, trying to avoid the curious gazes of those around him. Despite being the son of a prominent businessman, Michael carried no air of arrogance or grandeur. His father had always taught him, simplicity is the best way to let people see your true self. A hurried traveler bumped into his shoulder. "Out of the way," the man snapped without even looking back. Michael simply lowered his head, quietly stepped aside, and tightened his grip on his bag. The airport's announcement system crackled to life once more. Michael took a deep breath, adjusted his bag strap, and headed briskly toward Gate 14. Each step echoed in his mind, filled with both excitement and an inexplicable sense of unease. Gate 14 came into view, a space filled with the cold glow of fluorescent lights. A long line of passengers stretched ahead, each clutching suitcases, bags, or carefully wrapped gift boxes. The festive holiday spirit filled the air, yet Michael felt an inexplicable sense of detachment, as if no one truly noticed his presence. He approached the ticket counter, holding his boarding pass tightly in his hand. After a few moments of waiting, it was finally his turn. Behind the counter stood a woman, Emily Harper, dressed in a sharply tailored navy blue uniform. Her blonde hair was neatly tied in a high bun, her crimson lipstick exuding authority, but her cold eyes swept over Michael like an icy gust of wind. "Ticket?" she asked, her tone devoid of any warmth. Michael gently handed over his boarding pass. His small hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the tension building in his chest. Emily took the ticket, narrowing her eyes as she scrutinized it meticulously as though searching for some error. "Traveling alone?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "Yes, ma'am," Michael replied, trying to keep his tone steady. Emily sniffed, her gaze lingering on Michael's coat. "Strange, a kid traveling alone on an international flight. Where are your parents?" Her question wasn't one of genuine curiosity, but carried an undercurrent of scrutiny and contempt. Michael swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "My dad? He's waiting in San Francisco. I'm going home for Christmas." Emily let out a dry laugh, not a real laugh, but more of a derisive chuckle. "Fine, but remember, this isn't the place to cause trouble. Sit in your seat and don't bother anyone." She stamped his ticket and handed it back with a dismissive shove. Michael quickly caught it before it could fall to the ground, his cheeks flushing slightly with embarrassment. As he walked past the counter, he heard her mutter, just loud enough for him to catch, "I don't know why they let kids like that on flights." Her words felt like a dagger piercing his heart. Michael wanted to turn back and ask, "Kids like what?" But instead, he bowed his head and hurried on, leaving her scornful glare behind. In the jetway leading to the plane, Michael took a deep breath, silently telling himself that everything would be okay. Yet deep inside, a sense of hurt was growing, like the snow piling up outside, each flake adding to the weight that was becoming harder to bear. Michael stepped through the narrow hallway connecting the boarding gate to the airplane cabin. White LED lights from the overhead fixtures illuminated each small footprint on the red carpet. Outside the windows, the snow fell heavier, like delicate white petals blanketing the glass. In the distance, the aircraft's beacon lights blinked against the cold, gray sky. He took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease lingering after his encounter with Emily. "This flight won't take long," he told himself. "Just sit quietly. Read the little book I brought, and everything will be fine. But as soon as he stepped into the cabin, that feeling crept back, sharper than before. The airplane was bustling with passengers, their conversations and occasional laughter creating a cozy atmosphere that starkly contrasted with the snowstorm outside. Michael scanned the rows for his seat, 16B, a window seat in the middle section of the plane. He walked carefully down the aisle, making sure not to bump into anyone. When he reached his seat and placed his backpack on it, a cold voice spoke behind him. "What are you doing?" Startled, Michael turned to see Emily standing there, her hands on her hips, her gaze fixed on him like he was an unwelcome intruder. "This is my seat, 16B," Michael said politely, keeping his voice steady. Emily leaned down to inspect his ticket again, her brow furrowing. She glanced around the cabin and then back at Michael. "Listen, you should sit in the back. Seat 16B isn't suitable for someone like you." Her words hung in the air like a leaden weight, leaving an uncomfortable silence in their wake. Passengers nearby turned their heads, but most quickly looked away, pretending not to have heard. Michael hesitated, confused. "But my ticket says 16B." Emily cut him off. "The back. Go." Her eyes held no room for argument. Michael felt a chill seep into his chest, colder than the winter storm outside. Reluctantly, he clutched his backpack and shuffled toward the back of the cabin, near the restrooms. No one spoke up for him. The silence hung heavy, like an invisible fog, oppressive and suffocating. When Michael sat down in the rear seat, it felt harder, smaller, and more isolating than anything else around him. He gazed out of the window, watching the snow fall steadily. A single tear slid down his cheek, but he quickly wiped it away. "It's okay, Michael," he whispered to himself. "Just endure it a little longer, and you'll see Dad soon." Less than 10 minutes after Michael sat down, Emily appeared again, her face twisted into a scowl. This time she was carrying a tray of drinks. "What do you want? Water? Soda? Or maybe you don't need anything at all?" she asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Michael pressed his lips together and quietly replied, "Water, please." Emily placed the cup on the small tray table in front of him, but her movements were so rough that water sloshed out, spilling onto the book Michael was holding. Startled, Michael quickly set the book aside and grabbed a napkin to wipe it dry. "I didn't mean to," he mumbled, his worried eyes glancing up at her. Emily snorted, crossing her arms over her chest. "It's always someone else's fault, isn't it? Don't bother me again." Michael bowed his head, unsure of what to say. But deep inside, a sense of hurt began to build, as if every word, every action from Emily was another small knife cutting into his pride. He carefully placed the damp book back into his bag, avoiding her gaze. The other passengers remained silent, some stealing quick glances but saying nothing. Michael took a shaky breath, telling himself to stay calm, even as the weight of humiliation settled heavily on his small shoulders. Throughout the flight, Emily continued to make things difficult for Michael. When a passenger in the row ahead asked for a blanket, she brought one immediately, her face lit up with a friendly smile. But when Michael timidly asked for a blanket, her response was, "We don't have enough blankets for everyone." Later, when Michael reached for a cookie from the meal tray, Emily glanced at him and said loudly, "Don't drop crumbs on the seat. Kids like you always make a mess." This time, a few passengers nearby turned their heads to look. A middle-aged woman shook her head slightly, her expression showing quiet disapproval, but still no one spoke up. Michael bit his lip hard, lowering his gaze to his meal tray as if trying to make himself invisible. The atmosphere on the plane seemed to grow heavier around Michael. While other passengers drifted off to sleep or became engrossed in movies playing on the screens in front of them, the 12-year-old boy sat quietly, bracing himself against the judgmental looks and harsh words. He clenched his fists in his lap, willing himself not to cry. All he could do was hope for the flight to end soon so he could finally go home, a place where he knew love and safety awaited him. The steady rumble of the plane's engines droned on, an endless refrain blending with the faint murmurs and the rhythmic tapping of laptop keys from a few passengers. Outside the window, the world was pitch black, with only the blinking lights on the plane's wings piercing through the thick snow. Inside, the atmosphere seemed to slow down, offering a temporary lull after the chaos of the earlier hours. Michael sighed softly, pulling a book out of his backpack, hoping to find some solace in its familiar pages. It was an adventure novel, carefully chosen after weeks of thought, a gift for his father. As he turned the pages, he tried to immerse himself in the thrilling story. But every few sentences, Emily's cruel words echoed in his mind, like relentless reverberations that refused to fade. He bit his lip gently, his small hands clutching the edges of the book tightly. I shouldn't let her get to me, he whispered to himself, as though trying to force his mind to set aside the negativity. But his heart felt heavy, weighed down not just by Emily's actions, but by the silence of those around him, people who had seen it all yet chose to look away. Michael's thoughts turned to his father. His dad often told him, "You can overcome anything as long as you hold on to courage and kindness." The memory of those words felt like a small flame, flickering to life and warming him in that moment. He closed his eyes, picturing his dad waiting at the San Francisco airport, holding a thick winter coat and smiling brightly. The thought brought a hint of comfort, easing the weight in his chest just a little. As Michael became engrossed in the words of his book, a boy sitting next to him, around his age but dressed much more smartly, turned to him with curiosity. "What are you reading?" the boy asked, his eyes lighting up with interest. Michael smiled for the first time since the flight began. "An adventure novel. I'm planning to give it to my dad as a Christmas present." "That's cool," the boy replied, glancing admiringly at the book. But before they could continue the conversation, Emily appeared, her voice cutting through the air and extinguishing the brief sense of ease. "Don't bother other passengers," she said, her cold gaze fixed sharply on Michael. Startled, Michael quickly closed the book and looked down, his momentary smile vanishing. The other boy fell silent too, confusion evident on his face. Emily tilted her chin toward Michael, her voice sharper now. "If you can't stay quiet, I'll have to ask you to leave this seat." The cabin grew so quiet that Michael could hear his own heartbeat. Once again, none of the nearby passengers said a word. No one stepped in to point out that Michael hadn't done anything wrong. Michael lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting the frosty window. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but it no longer held the beauty it had when he first saw it. Now it seemed to mirror the icy coldness of the world he was facing. He hugged the book to his chest and sat still like a small statue, trying to shrink into himself to become invisible. But deep down, he knew that no matter how hard he tried, it wouldn't stop Emily from continuing to make his journey harder. The weight of the silence around him was heavier than ever, and the warmth he had felt moments earlier was gone, replaced by the biting chill of isolation. Michael curled up in the last row of the plane, clutching the book to his chest, seeking some comfort in the gift he had lovingly chosen for his father. But unease hung over him like a heavy cloud, and his worst fears were about to come true. Emily Harper appeared in the aisle, her cold gaze locked on Michael. Her high heels struck the floor with sharp, deliberate clicks, the sound reverberating through the cabin and silencing it. "Stand up," she said curtly, her tone slicing through the air. Michael looked up, startled. Is something wrong?" "Don't play innocent," Emily sneered, her lips curling with disdain. "Do you think sitting here quietly would make me forget about you?" Michael froze, confused. His eyes darted around, hoping for clarity or help. "I don't understand. I'm just sitting here." Sitting quietly, Emily gestured sharply toward the small snack bag on the tray table in front of him. "And what's this? You think this is a place to set up your own dining table? And look at the water you spilled. Do you think this is acceptable?" Michael stammered, his voice trembling. I I didn't mean to spill the water. I can clean it up." "Don't make excuses," Emily snapped, her voice rising. "Let me make one thing clear. This is an international flight, not a school bus for underprivileged kids." Her words hit like a blow, cutting into Michael's sense of dignity. He froze, his dark eyes welling with tears, unable to respond. He lowered his gaze, his shoulders trembling with the weight of her hostility. Emily pressed on, her voice dripping with condescension. "Don't think that just because you have a ticket, I have to treat you like other passengers. Look at yourself. Sitting here is just a nuisance to everyone." The murmur of a few nearby passengers began to rise, but no one spoke up. An older man raised an eyebrow in disapproval, but quickly looked down at his phone when Emily's sharp eyes darted toward him. "I didn't do anything wrong," Michael whispered, so softly that it was almost inaudible. Emily let out a scornful laugh. Wrong? Do you think I can't see the disruption you're causing here? I can't let this continue. You're getting off this plane, now. Panic gripped Michael's chest. But, but I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to go home to see my dad. His voice cracked and tears threatened to spill, but he fought to keep them back, hoping someone, anyone, would come to his defense. But the silence around him was deafening. Enough! Emily shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin and silencing everyone. She suddenly leaned down, snatched the book from Michael's hands, and slammed it onto the seat. Don't use your sob stories as an excuse. You don't deserve to be here. Michael bent down to pick up the book, his hands trembling. But before he could rise, a sharp slap landed across his face. The sound of the slap rang out like a crack of thunder, shocking everyone in the cabin. A woman nearby let out a soft gasp, but no one stood to intervene. Once again, the heavy silence settled over the plane, oppressive and suffocating, leaving Michael feeling as though he were drowning in darkness. Emily pointed toward the airplane door. You're not allowed to continue on this flight. Get out now. Michael slowly stood, clutching his backpack tightly to his chest. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but he refused to let out a sob. Step by step, he walked toward the exit, his head bowed low, trying to hide the humiliation that burned inside him. 2 airport security officers were already waiting at the plane's door. Without a word, they took hold of Michael's arms and escorted him off the aircraft. The bitter cold wind outside bit into his skin, making him shiver, not just from the freezing temperature, but from the pain and helplessness swelling in his heart. The world around him felt as frigid and unforgiving as the snowstorm swirling in the night. Michael was escorted off the plane under the curious yet indifferent gazes of the passengers seated near the door. The icy wind swept through the jet bridge connecting the aircraft to the terminal, making the boy shiver. His thick coat was no match for the piercing chill that enveloped him, a cold that came not just from the weather, but from the disdainful looks cast his way. 2 security officers were waiting at the end of the jet bridge. One was a tall man with a name tag reading Paul, and the other a young woman with sharp features and an unyielding, frosty expression. This the troublemaker? Paul asked Emily, his voice gruff and dismissive. I was expecting someone more serious. Turns out it's just a kid. Emily smirked, crossing her arms. Yeah, but he's more trouble than any of the serious ones. Take care of him. Kids like this, you've got to deal with them firmly. Paul let out a derisive chuckle and grabbed Michael's arm, ignoring how the boy flinched at his touch. Let's go, kid. The airport isn't your playground. Michael lowered his head and silently followed. He didn't utter a word, but his small shoulders quivered with each step. Every footfall seemed to resonate with the biting insults Emily had hurled at him, her words echoing endlessly in his mind. The air around him felt suffocating, as if the disdain and cruelty of the moment pressed down on his tiny frame, leaving him adrift in a sea of humiliation and isolation. They escorted Michael into a small, cold room with only a few metal chairs and an old table. The harsh, bluish-white glow of the fluorescent light above made the atmosphere even more suffocating. Michael was shoved into a chair and his backpack was yanked from his hands and thrown onto the table with a loud thud. Paul leaned against the wall, arms crossed, scrutinizing Michael from head to toe. So, kid, who do you think you are causing trouble on a plane like that? Michael raised his head slightly, his voice soft. I didn't do anything wrong. I just wanted to go home to see my dad. Go home to see your dad? Paul laughed loudly, the sound sharp and mocking. Listen, kid, this is an international airport, not some rundown neighborhood. Kids like you should stick to buses, not airplanes. Lisa, the female security officer standing next to Paul, smirked. Exactly. You think just anyone gets to board a plane? It's embarrassing. If it were up to me, a kid like you wouldn't have made it past the ticket counter. Michael stared down at his lap, his hands clenched tightly to keep himself from crying. He didn't want to cry in front of them, but every word they said cut deeper into his fragile sense of dignity, like sharp blades tearing at his soul. Do we need to call the police? Lisa asked, her tone indifferent, as though discussing a misplaced item rather than a young boy sitting before them. Paul nodded and stepped outside to contact airport security. Before leaving, he turned back to Michael, throwing one last jab. Stay put, kid. Don't do anything stupid. Honestly, your dad probably doesn't care about a troublemaker like you anyway. Michael sat frozen, every ounce of strength focused on holding back the tears threatening to fall. The the coldness of the room matched the chill in his heart as he silently endured yet another wave of humiliation. When the room was finally silent, leaving Michael alone, he pulled out his phone, his hands trembling. He stared at the screen, where his father's number was already displayed. A tear slid down his cheek, landing on the screen and smudging it slightly. He took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The familiar, deep voice of his father answered on the other end, warm and reassuring. Michael, what's wrong? Are you okay? Dad. Michael's voice cracked. He tried to speak clearly, but couldn't stop the wave of emotions from overtaking him. I I was kicked off the plane. They said I caused trouble, but I didn't do anything wrong, Dad. I swear. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then Jonathan Carter's voice came through, no longer just warm, but resolute and commanding. Listen to me, son. You've done nothing wrong. Don't cry. Stay right where you are. I'll handle everything. Michael nodded instinctively, even though his father couldn't see him. In his father's voice, there was a certainty, a strength that felt like a beam of light cutting through the storm raging both outside the room and inside Michael's heart. For the first time that night, Michael allowed himself to hope. Inside the cold, sterile security room, Michael sat silently, his red-rimmed eyes fixed on his backpack, which had been carelessly tossed onto the table. Snow continued to fall heavily outside, blanketing the large airport windows in white, but Michael couldn't feel anything beyond the suffocating grip of fear and helplessness in his chest. He had just put down the phone after speaking with his father. A small spark of hope had begun to grow within him, but it was tangled with threads of doubt. His father, Jonathan Carter, was a strong and commanding figure, but could he really change what had just happened? In the main terminal of Liberty Sky Airport, the atmosphere suddenly shifted. A group of people dressed in sleek black suits strode briskly past security, led by a tall man with an air of authority. Jonathan Carter moved with purposeful strides, his sharp gaze locked ahead. Flanking him were a team of lawyers and assistants, all carrying briefcases and phones, their fingers busy typing and dialing. Passengers in the terminal began murmuring as they recognized him. A few raised their phones to take photos, but none dared approach. Jonathan Carter, the CEO of a multinational conglomerate, was not just wealthy, but immensely powerful in the business world. Mr. Carter, we've confirmed that Michael is being held in the security room, one of his assistants reported as they walked. Jonathan gave a curt nod but didn't reply. His face was an unreadable mask, but his cold, piercing eyes betrayed the fury boiling beneath his composed exterior. As he approached his destination, the hum of the terminal seemed to fade, replaced by a palpable tension that followed him like a storm cloud. Jonathan Carter was not a man to be trifled with, and everyone who saw him knew it. When Jonathan stepped into the small room where Michael was waiting, the air seemed to freeze. Paul and Lisa, the two security officers, immediately stood up, their faces betraying clear signs of unease. They hadn't anticipated that the boy they had dismissed so readily had such a powerful father. Jonathan didn't waste a word on pleasantries. He walked straight to Michael, kneeling down so he could look his son in the eyes. "Are you okay, Michael?" His voice was gentle, but his eyes burned with deep concern. Michael nodded faintly, though his small shoulders still trembled. "I didn't do anything wrong, Dad. They kicked me off the plane." Jonathan rose to his full height, turning his gaze toward Paul and Lisa, his expression icy and unyielding. "Who's in charge here?" he asked, his voice low but brimming with authority. Paul hesitated, then stepped forward, trying to compose himself. "Mr. Carter, we were just following protocol. This boy was disruptive on the flight." "Silence," Jonathan interrupted, his tone cutting like a blade. "I'm not interested in excuses. Do you have any idea what kind of humiliation you've subjected a 12-year-old child to?" Lisa stammered. "Sir, we were just acting on the instructions of the head flight attendant." "Then bring her here. Now." Jonathan's command was sharp and unequivocal, his piercing gaze silencing any potential objections. Paul nodded hastily, retreating from the room to summon Emily. Lisa remained rooted in place, her face pale, nervously clutching the edge of her belt as Jonathan's intense stare lingered on her. In the tense silence that followed, Michael glanced at his father, his small hands gripping the edge of the chair. For the first time that night, he felt a sense of safety returning, like a protective barrier had been placed between him and the world's harshness. Less than 10 minutes later, Emily Harper entered the room, her uniform pristine and her demeanor composed. But when she saw Jonathan standing before her, she hesitated. Though she didn't yet know exactly who he was, his presence alone was enough to make her uneasy. "Mr. Carter, I was told you wanted to see me," she said, her voice steady, though a faint hint of apprehension crept in. Jonathan stepped forward, his gaze piercing through her. "Are you Emily Harper, the head flight attendant on Liberty 747? "Yes, sir," she replied, straightening her posture. "I was the one who made the decision to remove this boy from the flight due to disruptive behavior." "Disruptive behavior?" Jonathan repeated, each word deliberate and weighty, his voice so deep and commanding that it seemed to reverberate through the room. What exactly did he do that was so disruptive? Spill water, sit in the wrong seat, or is it that his very existence didn't align with your discriminatory standards? Emily took an instinctive step back, her composure faltering. "Sir, I was following protocol. I couldn't allow a passenger to jeopardize the safety of the flight." Jonathan let out a cold, humorless laugh. "You slapped my son. You humiliated him in front of dozens of passengers. And then you called airport security to treat a 12-year-old child like a criminal. Do you believe that was justified?" Emily began to stammer, her voice quieter now. I was only following procedures." Jonathan stepped closer, his tone icy. Uh, Procedures? Then let me show you what real accountability looks like. As of this moment, you are no longer the head flight attendant on any flight, and I will make sure you never have the chance to degrade another human being again. He turned to his team of lawyers, his voice commanding. "I want Liberty Sky Airlines held accountable for this entire ordeal. Inform the board of directors that I will meet them in 1 hour. They have until then to prepare." The room fell silent, except for the faint rustle of papers as the legal team began making rapid phone calls and taking notes. Emily stood frozen, her face pale, as the weight of Jonathan's words and authority crushed any remaining shred of confidence she had brought into the room. Jonathan Carter left the security room with his team of lawyers, Michael walking close by his side. The boy clung tightly to his father's hand, feeling an unshakable sense of safety in his presence. Jonathan's commanding demeanor turned heads as they passed through the terminal, but no one dared to speak a word. When they arrived at the VIP meeting room where the Liberty Sky Airlines board of directors was waiting, Jonathan didn't take a seat. He stood tall, placing both hands firmly on the table as he looked each person in the room directly in the eye. "I'll keep this brief," he began, his voice deep and cold, like thunder rolling through a winter storm. "My son, a 12-year-old boy, was humiliated, assaulted, and removed from one of your flights, without any justifiable reason. I want answers." A middle-aged man, Richard Hale, the chief operating officer of Liberty Sky, attempted a conciliatory smile. "Mr. Carter, we deeply regret this incident. There must have been some kind of misunderstanding. We will thoroughly investigate." "Misunderstanding?" Jonathan's voice cut through Richard's words, sharp as a blade. "A child was slapped by a flight attendant called undeserving and thrown off a plane as though he were a criminal. You call that a misunderstanding?" Richard faltered, glancing nervously at the other executives in the room. I I understand your frustration, but we need time to gather the facts and—" Jonathan interrupted again, his tone now openly seething with anger. "I'm not interested in empty apologies or drawn-out investigations. I demand action, and I demand it now." The room fell into an uneasy silence, each board member exchanging anxious looks, the weight of Jonathan's words hanging heavily in the air. Michael, standing quietly at his father's side, watched the scene unfold, feeling a renewed sense of strength as his father refused to back down. Jonathan turned to one of his lawyers, a young woman named Claire Morton. She stood, opened the briefcase she was holding, and placed a stack of documents firmly on the table. "These are clear pieces of evidence of discriminatory behavior and the assault of a minor by the cabin crew on Liberty Flight 747, Claire said firmly. We have collected witness statements from other passengers and footage from the airport's surveillance cameras. Richard's face went pale. Footage? Claire nodded. That's correct. The plane hadn't taken off yet, so the entire incident at the gate and on board was captured. This evidence is indisputable. Jonathan stepped forward, his gaze razor sharp. I demand immediate accountability from Liberty Sky Airlines. First, every member of the cabin crew on that flight is to be suspended. Second, the leadership responsible for this gross negligence must resign. Third, your airline will issue a public apology to my son across all major media platforms. Another board member, Linda Parker, spoke up, her voice trembling. Mr. Carter, we understand the severity of the situation, but the measures you're requesting will take time to implement. Jonathan slammed his hand down on the table with a force that made the entire room jolt. You have time, but my son doesn't. A child cannot be left to suffer because of your incompetence. Do you think I'll sit idly by and wait? Linda fell silent, too intimidated to respond. The tension in the room was suffocating, each executive acutely aware that they were dealing with a man unwilling to compromise, especially when it came to defending his son. Jonathan's presence was a storm, and no one in the room dared to stand in its path. Jonathan turned to Richard, his gaze unwavering. You don't need to struggle with your decisions any longer. I've just signed the order to acquire Liberty Sky. The room fell into stunned silence. Some gaped openly while others exchanged bewildered glances. Richard stammered, You're saying you bought the airline? Jonathan smirked, the first hint of a smile during the entire meeting. But it was a smile colder than the winter storm outside. That's correct. Liberty Sky is now my property, and I will not allow it to remain a haven for injustice and discrimination. He turned to Claire. Begin restructuring immediately. Every individual connected to Liberty Flight 747, including Emily Harper, is to be terminated. I want a public statement issued within the next hour. Let no one in this room think they can evade accountability. An hour later, Liberty Sky Airlines released an official press statement titled, Discrimination Has No Place. Liberty Sky Airlines commits to comprehensive reform. The statement included a public apology to Michael Carter and his family, the suspension of all personnel involved with Liberty Flight 747, and the initiation of a complete restructuring of the cabin crew team. Jonathan didn't stop there. He announced the establishment of a foundation called Michael's Voice, dedicated to advocating for the rights of the vulnerable and combating discrimination across all public service sectors. The fund's mission, spearheaded by Jonathan and named in honor of his son, promised to turn an act of cruelty into a powerful movement for change, ensuring no child or individual would have to endure what Michael had faced that day. Jonathan Carter's private jet lifted gently off the snowy runway of Liberty Sky Airport, ascending into the night sky blanketed in white. Inside the luxurious cabin, Michael sat beside his father on a plush leather seat. His small hands still clutched the book, the gift he had spent a year saving up to buy for him. But this time there was no trembling or fear in his expression. Instead, his eyes reflected relief and trust. Jonathan glanced at his son with warmth in his gaze. Are you cold? He asked, draping a soft blanket over Michael's small shoulders. Michael shook his head lightly, a faint smile gracing his lips. No, Dad, I'm okay now. The two sat quietly for a few moments, the steady hum of the plane's engines filling the cabin. Michael hesitated, then turned to his father, his voice barely above a whisper. Dad, I'm sorry. I couldn't do anything to stand up for myself. Jonathan placed a firm but gentle hand on his son's shoulder. Michael, you have nothing to apologize for. No one has the right to make you feel small or unworthy. You're far stronger than you realize, and I'm so proud of you. Michael felt a warmth spread through his chest, melting away the last remnants of fear and pain. Silent tears rolled down his cheeks, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude. As the plane soared higher into the serene night, father and son sat side by side, the storm of the day behind them. For Michael, the darkness outside no longer felt cold or daunting. With his father by his side, the world seemed brighter, safer, and filled with endless possibilities. As the plane touched down in San Francisco, Michael stepped out of the cabin and felt the crisp chill of Christmas Eve. Yet his heart was filled with warmth. In the distance, he could see the golden glow from the family mansion, where a beautifully decorated Christmas tree waited, its lights twinkling like stars. Jonathan held his hand as they walked up the snow-covered steps. When the door opened, the warm light from inside poured out, embracing them like a mother's arms. Beneath the Christmas tree, a large gift box sat neatly, a card on top that read, "Welcome home, Michael." Michael turned to his father, his eyes sparkling with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. Not just for this gift, but for everything." Jonathan knelt down and hugged his son tightly. "Michael, you are the greatest Christmas gift I've ever received." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but it no longer felt cold. The distant chime of church bells blended with the soft glow of Christmas lights, as if to remind them and the world that no matter how harsh life could be, love and justice would always prevail. Thank you for taking the time to listen to Michael Carter's story. Don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other meaningful stories. Turn on notifications, and let's continue spreading positive values to everyone.